Clara Bennett pressed her grandfather's map against her chest and screamed into the empty desert sky. Not from fear, not from pain, from rage. Because 3 hours ago, she had stood in her family's house, the house her father built with his own bleeding hands, and watched strangers carry out every piece of furniture, while her cousins signed papers she had never been allowed to read. The farm was gone. The land was gone. The life her father had promised her was gone. And not one person in that town had done a single thing to stop it. She was 25 years old, heavy-set, and completely alone. And every person she had ever trusted had just proven they believed she was nothing. But Clara Bennett was not nothing, and the desert was about to find that out. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart racing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city down in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that desert. Because what Clara was about to find had been waiting 90 years for exactly the right person to come looking. The town of Harlow Creek, Colorado Territory, had a way of deciding who a person was before that person ever opened their mouth. It decided based on how you looked, how you walked, how much space you took up in a room. And once Harlow Creek made up its mind about you, there was almost no use fighting it. Clara Bennett had been fighting it her entire life. She was born in the winter of 1859, the only daughter of Joseph Bennett, a man who farmed 40 acres of dry Colorado soil with nothing but determination, and the belief that hard work was its own kind of prayer. Joseph was not a wealthy man. He was not a connected man. But he was an honest man, and honest men in frontier towns were either deeply respected or quietly ignored. Joseph Bennett was ignored, and so was his daughter. Clara grew up large-boned and broad-shouldered with thick hands that could fix a broken harness or haul water from the creek without complaint. She had her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's stubborn jaw, and from the time she was old enough to understand what people said about her, she understood that Harlow Creek had already written her story for her. The story went like this. Clara Bennett was the big girl who would never marry, never thrive, never matter. She would live and die in the shadow of her father's modest farm, quietly useful to everyone around her and deeply invisible to the world. Clara had spent 25 years deciding whether to believe that story. The morning everything changed. She was standing in her father's kitchen, making the first pot of coffee she had brewed since his burial 3 weeks earlier. Joseph Bennett had died quietly in his sleep, the way good men sometimes did, without ceremony and without warning. One morning he was there. The next morning he was not. And the grief of it had settled into Clara's body like stone, heavy and permanent and difficult to carry. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried since. She had simply worked, fed the horses, repaired the fence, collected the eggs. Because working was the only thing she knew how to do with pain, and her father had taught her that the land didn't stop needing you just because your heart was broken. She was pouring her coffee when the wagon pulled up. She heard the wheels before she saw them, heard the creak of wood and the sound of men talking in low business-like voices. She set down the coffee pot slowly and walked to the window. 3 men. 2 she did not recognize. 1 she did. Her cousin Gerald Bennett stood in the yard, looking at the farmhouse, the way a man looks at something he has just purchased. Clara was outside before her coffee even cooled. Gerald. Her voice was flat, controlled. What is this? Gerald was 10 years older than Clara, thin and sharp-faced, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own right to take up space in a room. He turned when he heard her voice and gave her the kind of smile that was not really a smile at all. Clara. He tucked his hands into his vest pockets. I'm glad you're here. Saves me having to send someone to find you. What are these men doing on my father's land? Gerald sighed, which Clara recognized as the sound a man makes when he believes he is explaining something to someone too simple to understand it on their own. That's just it, Clara. It isn't your father's land anymore. Your father passed without a proper will. The estate reverts to the nearest male heir, and under Colorado territorial law, that's me. Clara stared at him. My father had a farm. I have worked this farm every day of my life. There is no male heir. There is only me. There's only you, Gerald agreed pleasantly. Which is why the decision was made by the family. We thought it was kinder to handle things quietly. You thought it was kinder, Clara repeated. You're a young woman alone, Clara. What would you do with 40 acres? How would you manage it? Who would help you? He spread his hands. We're doing you a kindness. You'll have time to find a situation somewhere. A boarding house in town maybe. Or a domestic position. One of the men behind Gerald had begun walking toward the house. Stop. Clara said it quietly. The man stopped. Gerald's expression flickered, just slightly. Clara, show me the papers. She said it again. If you have legal documents, show them to me. Gerald hesitated, and in that hesitation, Clara saw something she filed away carefully. He had papers. She was nearly certain of it. But she was also nearly certain those papers had been constructed with more speed than care, signed by men who assumed no one would look too closely, because no one ever looked too closely at what happened to a woman like Clara Bennett. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. Clara took it, read it carefully, read it again. Her father's name was there. Her cousin's name was there. The seal of the county clerk was there. And her name was nowhere. I need to speak with a lawyer, she said. Gerald almost laughed. Clara, be reasonable. I am being entirely reasonable. She handed the papers back to him. I need 3 days. The buyers. 3 days, Gerald. She met his eyes, and whatever he saw there made him stop talking. Give me 3 days before anyone sets foot in this house again. 3 days, and then I will be gone. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded the way a man nods when he believes he has already won. 3 days. Then we proceed. Clara watched him drive away. Then she went back inside, finished her coffee, and went to find her grandfather's trunk. Eli Bennett had been dead for 11 years. He had died at the age of 78, sharp-minded, until the very end, in the same bed where his son would later die in that same quiet, unannounced way. In life, Eli had been a surveyor, a trapper, and at various points, a storyteller of considerable reputation. He had crossed more of the American West than most men born in that century, and he had carried his memories of it in a battered leather trunk that lived at the foot of his bed. When Eli died, Clara had been 14 years old. On his last night when the rest of the family had gone home, and Clara was the only one left sitting beside him. Eli had pressed something into her hand. It was a map. Hand-drawn on thick paper, the lines faded, but legible, marked in Eli's careful surveyor's hand. He had held her wrist while she held it, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. You remember what I told you about the Whitmore wagon train? He said. It was not a question. Yes, Granddaddy. You find it someday, Clara girl, when you need it. He coughed, settled. Promise me. I promise. He had smiled, and then he had closed his eyes, and by morning he was gone. Clara had kept the map for 11 years, folded and refolded, until the creases were soft as cloth, tucked into the same leather satchel she carried everywhere. She had told no one about it, not her father, not the women at church, not the few girls she had been careful enough to call friends over the years. She had kept it because she had promised, and because something in her grandfather's voice that night had told her the promise mattered more than she understood yet. Now sitting on the floor of her father's kitchen, with the trunk open in front of her, and the map spread across her knees, Clara began to understand. The map showed a stretch of Colorado desert, roughly 40 miles southwest of Harlow Creek. It showed a dry riverbed, a cluster of unusual rock formations Eli had labeled with his own notation, and a series of marks leading to a single point he had circled twice in heavy ink. In the margin, in handwriting. So small. Clara had to lean close to read it. Her grandfather had written Whitmore train. Buried in the sandstorm of 1804. One wagon intact. Cargo unknown, but significant. Trust the land, not the men. 80 years. The wagon had been buried for 80 years. Clara sat with that for a long moment. Then she stood, folded the map, tucked it into her satchel, and began packing. She left before dawn on the second day. She told no one, because there was no one worth telling. She took the horse her father had left her, a sturdy brown mare named Patience, which Clara had always privately thought was a fine name for a horse belonging to a Bennett, and she loaded the saddlebags with what she needed: a bedroll, a canteen, dried food for 4 days, a short-handled shovel, her father's compass, a lantern and enough oil to last her 3 nights, and the map. She rode out of Harlow Creek in the dark, before the sun had begun to color the horizon, before any of the shop owners had unlocked their doors, or any of the farmers had started their morning chores. She rode past the church where her father's funeral had been held, past the general store, where she had traded eggs for salt every Thursday for 3 years, past the land office, where someone had stamped an official seal on her inheritance, and handed it to a man who had done nothing to earn it. She rode past all of it, without looking back. The desert was not kind. Clara had known that intellectually, the way a person knows something they have read about but never experienced. She knew the sun would be brutal. She knew the distances would be longer than they looked on the map. She knew there would be no shade, no streams, and very little mercy. What she had not fully anticipated was the silence. Not the absence of sound exactly. There was wind. There were birds she could not see. There was the steady rhythm of Patience's hooves against the hardpan. But there was a quality to the desert quiet that pressed against her ears and against her thoughts in equal measure. And in that silence, everything she had been refusing to feel for 3 weeks began to surface. She missed her father. She missed him with a sharpness that caught her off guard, the way grief sometimes waited for you to be still before it arrived. She missed the sound of him moving around the kitchen in the early morning. She missed the way he always asked about the horses before he asked about anything else. She missed his voice low and certain, telling her things she did not know she was memorizing until she needed them. She thought about what Gerald had said. What would you do with 40 acres? How would you manage it? Who would help you? She thought about all the people in Harlow Creek who had watched her father's cousins arrive and had said nothing, done nothing, looked away. She thought about her grandfather's voice on his last night pressing the map into her hand. When you need it, Clara girl. She pressed her heels gently against Patience's sides and rode harder. By midday of the first day, the rock formations her grandfather had marked on the map began to appear on the horizon. She had studied the map so many times that the landmarks felt almost familiar. The way places in a dream sometimes feel like places you have been before. She navigated by the compass and by the formations themselves, checking the map against what she saw, adjusting her direction in small increments the way her grandfather had taught her. The land speaks. Eli had told her once when she was small and sitting beside him while he worked at his surveying instruments. Most people don't listen because they're too busy talking. But if you get quiet and you pay attention, the land will tell you where it's been. She paid attention now. She found the dry riverbed by late afternoon, exactly where the map indicated. She followed it west for 2 miles, watching the ground and the rock faces on either side, reading the subtle shifts in the terrain, the way her grandfather had taught her to read a printed page. She stopped when she found the first sign. It was almost nothing. A slight depression in the earth, barely visible, the kind of thing a person could walk directly over and never notice. But the shape of it was wrong for natural erosion. Too regular, too deliberate. Clara dismounted, crouched, pressed her hand flat against the ground. She could feel it before she could see it. Something was down there. She made camp before full dark, built a small fire, and ate without tasting anything. She was not afraid exactly. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was aware acutely that she was 40 miles from the nearest town, entirely alone, pursuing something that everyone she knew would have called foolishness. She was aware that if she was wrong about this, she had used her 3 days on nothing, and she would return to Harlow Creek with nothing, and the house would already be empty, and the land already signed over, and there would be nothing left to fight with. She was aware of all of that. She was also aware that she was her grandfather's granddaughter, and her grandfather had never once put his faith in something that wasn't real. She slept, woke before dawn, and began to dig. The ground was harder than it looked. That first morning she made slow progress, working the shovel in careful, methodical strokes, the way her father had taught her to do anything that required patience, slowly enough to do it right, fast enough to actually get it done. The sun climbed. Her shoulders ached. Her hands, already calloused from years of farm work, found new ways to protest. She kept going. She was 3 hours into the work when she heard Patience make a sound. Not distress exactly, something more like attention. Clara straightened up and turned. A man on horseback was watching her from 30 feet away. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of tan that came from years of outdoor work, and the kind of stillness that came from a man who was comfortable being alone. His horse was a dark gray, well-kept, with the easy stance of an animal that had been around enough work not to be bothered by it. The man had a hat pulled low against the sun, but even with it, she could see he was watching her with an expression that was not threatening. It was curious, and something else she could not quite name. "Ma'am," he said, "just that." Clara kept her hands on the shovel. "You're on open territory. I'm not doing anything illegal." "I can see that." He did not move, did not advance, just sat on his horse with that same watchful stillness. "You're digging a long way from any town." "That's my business." "Yes, ma'am." He tilted his head slightly. "You're Bennett's daughter, Joseph Bennett's girl." Clara went still. "How do you know that?" He reached up and pushed the brim of his hat back slightly, and she saw his face more clearly. Strong jaw, dark eyes with something careful in them, a scar along the left side of his chin that was old enough to be permanent. "My name is Callum Hayes. I ranched the territory east of your father's land couple years back. I knew your father some. Good man." She studied him. "My father never mentioned a Hayes." "No, ma'am, he wouldn't have. We only talked a handful of times. Fence line disputes mostly. He was fair about it." Callum paused. "I heard about what happened, with the cousins." Something moved through Clara's chest. She tamped it down. Word travels fast. It does in a small territory. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not here to interfere in your—" "Miss Bennett. I was riding the southwest range checking strays, and I saw the smoke from your fire last night. Came to see who was out here." "Well," Clara said, "now you know." Callum looked at the disturbed ground around her, at the shovel, at the determined set of her jaw. He did not ask what she was looking for. He did not tell her she was wasting her time. He did not say a single one of the things every other person in her life would have said. Instead, he said, "You eaten today?" Clara blinked. "I had provisions. That's not what I asked." He swung down from the horse with the easy movement of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "I've got dried elk and some hardtack. Won't take long." He glanced at her hands on the shovel. "You can go right back to digging after. I won't keep you." She almost told him to leave. She was not in her experience a woman who accepted help easily. Help had too often come with conditions, with assumptions, with the particular look of pity that she had been seeing on people's faces since she was old enough to understand it. But Callum Hayes did not look at her with pity. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone doing a hard thing and doing it without complaint, with a kind of straightforward respect that Clara was not accustomed to receiving from a man she had just met. "All right," she said finally. She did not put down the shovel, but she walked over to where he had started building a small fire, and she sat and she ate, and for 20 minutes neither of them said much of anything. It was the most comfortable silence she had been in for 3 weeks. Callum stayed. She had not asked him to. He had not asked permission. He had simply, after they finished eating, walked over to the disturbed ground, looked at it for a moment and said, "You're working the wrong angle. Ground's compacted different here. You want to come in from the east side." Clara had looked at him for a long moment. "And you know this because I've dug post holes in this territory for 10 years, he said. "And because your grandfather's map, whatever's on it, is pointing you to something that settled deep. Things that settle deep shift east when the sandstorm drives them. Always east. Clara stared at him. I never said anything about a map. Callum met her eyes. No, ma'am, you didn't. A long pause. My grandfather, she said carefully, told a few people about the Whitmore train over the years. He told my grandfather, Callum said. Who told me? He looked at the ground again. I never thought anyone would actually come looking. I'm not sure I thought it was real, to tell you plain. He glanced up. Reckon I was wrong. Clara looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, at the steady way he held himself with no agenda she could see and no particular need to pretend at one. From the east side, she said. Yes, ma'am. She picked up the shovel. Then let's try the east side. It took the rest of that day and most of the following morning. They worked in shifts, Callum taking the shovel when Clara's arms gave out, Clara taking it back when she had recovered enough. They did not talk much while they worked. There was something about the rhythm of it that made conversation feel unnecessary. The two of them moving around each other in the quiet of the desert, with the easy coordination of people who had been working beside each other for years rather than hours. She did not know what to make of him. She was not accustomed to not knowing what to make of a person. People in Clara's experience were usually readable within the first few minutes, their intentions visible in their faces, their assumptions about her visible even faster. Callum Hayes was harder to read than most. He was not performing generosity for her benefit. He was not pretending at a respect he did not feel. He simply worked and occasionally said something useful and looked at her like she was exactly what she was, a capable woman doing a difficult job. It was disorienting, in a way she did not entirely mind. On the second afternoon, the shovel hit something solid. Not rock. The sound was different. Hollow. Wooden. Clara went still. Callum straightened from where he had been working 3 feet away and looked at her. That it, he said. Clara's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She pressed the shovel against the resistance again. The same hollow sound. The same resistance. Definitely wood. Old wood, but intact. That's it, she said. They worked faster after that careful but urgent clearing the soil away from the edges of what revealed itself inch by inch to be the remains of a wagon. Most of it was gone. The wood collapsed, the canvas eaten by time, the frame reduced to fragile splinters that fell apart at the touch. 3 of the wagons they uncovered were little more than ghost shapes in the dirt, suggestions of what they had been. But the 4th one, the deepest one, the one that had been buried, not just by the sandstorm, but by the collapse of the others above, it was different. The wood was darkened and compressed, but it held. The iron fittings had rusted, but not dissolved. The cargo inside, whatever it was, had been wrapped in oilskin layer after layer of it, as though the person who packed it had understood that it might need to wait a very long time. Clara knelt in the dirt beside it. Her grandfather's voice was in her ear. When you need it, Clara girl. She reached out and pulled back the first layer of oilskin. Inside were crates. Wooden, iron-banded, initialed in brass letters. N.W. Nathaniel Whitmore. She looked at Callum. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on a man's face directed at her. Not pity, not skepticism. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like faith. Open it, he said. Clara took a breath. And she did. Daw. The first crate held instruments, glass lenses, brass fittings, metal arms, folded into precise configurations she did not recognize, but that her grandfather would have. Surveying equipment. Astronomical equipment. Tools she had no names for, that vibrated with the particular purposefulness of objects built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The second crate held maps. Dozens of them rolled in oilskin tubes, each one labeled in tiny, meticulous handwriting. Maps of territories. Maps of sky. Maps of things Clara had never seen mapped before. The third crate held journals. Leather-bound, water-stained but legible, written in a hand so precise it almost looked typeset. Clara's hands were shaking as she lifted the first journal. She told herself it was the cold. The desert cooled fast at that hour. She told herself that. She opened to the first page. At the top, in letters larger than the rest, Nathaniel Whitmore had written, "This belongs to whoever is brave enough to find it. Please continue what I could not finish." Clara read that line 3 times. "What does it say?" Callum asked quietly. He had given her space without being asked. She looked up at him. Her voice, when she found it, was steadier than she expected. "It says keep reading." And she did. Nathaniel Whitmore, Clara learned, had been not just an inventor, but a man possessed by a singular consuming idea that knowledge should not belong only to the wealthy or the powerful. That ordinary people, farmers and laborers, women and children, the poor and the overlooked, deserved access to the same understanding of the natural world that the educated classes hoarded behind the walls of universities and private societies. He had spent 30 years building the instruments in those crates. 30 years developing a system of teaching that anyone could use. 30 years dreaming of a place, a physical place, a real building somewhere in the American West where anyone who wanted to learn could come and be taught free of charge, free of judgment, free of the assumption that some people deserved knowledge and others did not. He had been on his way to find that place when the sandstorm took him. In the back of the final journal, tucked into a sleeve sewn into the cover, were 2 things. The first was a letter, handwritten on paper so old it had yellowed to the color of old bone, but every word still legible. The second was a small canvas pouch. Clara opened the pouch first. Gold coins. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough for materials, enough for a building, enough for a beginning. She opened the letter last. It was addressed simply to the finder. "If you have come this far," Nathaniel Whitmore had written, "then you are not the kind of person who gives up easily. I do not know your name. I do not know your circumstances. I know only that you found this when everyone else stopped looking, which tells me everything I need to know about you. The money is yours to use as you see fit. But I have a request. Not a demand. I am in no position to make demands being dead. A request only. Take this work somewhere. It can do good. Build something where the people who are always told they don't matter can come and find out that they do. You will know the place when you find it. You will know the people when you meet them. Trust that. Trust yourself. The world is full of people who were told they were not enough. Most of them believed it. Some of them didn't. I believe you are one of the ones who didn't. Sincerely and with gratitude. Nathaniel Whitmore, October 1803. Clara sat in the desert holding the letter of a dead man who had never known her name. For a long time she did not speak. Callum sat a few feet away, not watching her, giving her the privacy of the moment without leaving her alone in it. The sun was low now, painting the rocks in shades of copper and rust. Finally she said, "He believed someone would come." "Seems like." "He didn't know who." "No." Clara folded the letter carefully. "He wrote it to someone like me." She was not asking. Callum looked at her then. His dark eyes in the fading light were steady and direct. "Yes, ma'am, he said. "I believe he did." She looked at the crates around her, at the instruments and the maps and the journals, at the small pouch of gold coins that represented one man's entire faith that the right person would eventually show up to carry his work forward. She looked at her own hands, calloused, strong, capable of more than anyone in Harlow Creek had ever given her credit for. Her grandfather had said, "When you need it, Clara girl." She had thought he meant when she needed money, when she needed rescue. She understood now that he had meant something different. He had meant when she needed to know who she was. She needed it now. And it had been here the whole time, buried under 80 years of desert silence, waiting for exactly the right person to come and dig it out. Clara Bennett stood up. She brushed the dirt from her hands. She looked at the horizon, already darkening toward night, and she thought about Harlow Creek, 40 miles away, where 3 days had nearly run out, and a man named Gerald believed she had nowhere left to go. He was wrong. She had somewhere to go. She had somewhere to build. And for the first time since she had stood in her father's kitchen and heard the sound of wagon wheels pulling up outside, Clara Bennett felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief, not anger, something quieter, something with weight to it. She felt like herself. "We should camp here tonight," she said. "We'll need to figure out how to transport the crates in the morning." Callum stood. He reached up to tip his hat brim, a small gesture simple without drama or performance. "I've got the wagon," he said. "Brought it in case." Clara looked at him. "You brought a wagon?" "Yes, ma'am." "You brought a wagon on a routine stray-checking ride." The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "I reckon I had a feeling." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It surprised her. She had not laughed since before her father died. It came out rough and unexpected and entirely genuine, and Callum Hayes watched it happen with the expression of a man who had been waiting for it without knowing he was waiting. "All right," she said when she caught herself. "Then let's make camp. Tomorrow we go back to Harlow Creek." She looked out at the dark desert, already bright with stars. "I have a few things to say to some people," she said, "and a letter from a dead man to back me up." The wagon rolled back toward Harlow Creek with the weight of 80 years riding in the bed behind them. Clara sat up front beside Callum, the map folded in her lap. Nathaniel Whitmore's letter tucked inside her coat against her chest. She had read it 4 times since breaking camp that morning. Each time the words settled differently. Each time she understood something new about what she was carrying and what it meant. Callum drove without speaking much, which she had already come to recognize as his natural state. He was not a man who filled silence with noise. He let it exist, and she found she was grateful for that, because her mind was already loud enough without anyone adding to it. "You're thinking about Gerald," he said about 2 hours into the ride. Clara did not ask how he knew. "I'm thinking about the land office," she said. "And whoever signed those transfer documents." "Amos Whitfield," Callum said. "He's been county clerk for 12 years, does what he's told by the men who matter in this territory." "And who matters?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "Eli Crane. Owns the lumber operation north of town. Half the merchants in Harlow Creek owe him money. Gerald Bennett was not the one who arranged this on his own. A man like Gerald doesn't have the reach to push a property transfer through in 3 days without help." Clara turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I tried to buy your father's east pasture 2 years ago," Callum said. "Legitimate offer, fair price, directly to your father. He turned me down, which was his right. But 3 days later, I had 2 men come to my ranch telling me that land in that area was better left to established interests and that I should consider my offer withdrawn." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Eli Crane's men." Clara's jaw tightened. "My father never told me." "No, he wouldn't have." Callum glanced at her briefly. "He was protecting you." She looked at her hands, at the calluses across her palms that matched her father's, built from the same work on the same land. "He should have told me." "Maybe." Callum shifted the reins slightly. "Or maybe he figured you'd find out on your own when the time came." She didn't answer that, but she thought about it for the rest of the morning. They stopped once to water the horses at a creek bed that still held a thin line of water, and while Patience drank, Clara pulled out the first of Whitmore's journals and began reading again. She had read portions of it the night before by firelight, her eyes moving fast across the tiny handwriting, trying to absorb as much as she could before dark made it impossible. What she found reading carefully now in the full light of morning was that Nathaniel Whitmore had been more than a dreamer. He had been a strategist. The journals were not just records of his inventions, they were records of his thinking. The way he approached problems. The way he identified what people needed that they didn't know they needed. The way he found leverage in situations that looked like dead ends. There was a passage in the 3rd journal that she had underlined twice in her mind, because she had nothing to mark the page with. The men who control resources always believe that control is permanent. It is not. Control is only as strong as the agreement of the people being controlled. When that agreement ends, so does the control. The task is not to overpower the men at the top. The task is to change the agreement of the people at the bottom. Clara read it again. Then she put the journal away and looked at the horizon. She thought she was beginning to understand what Nathaniel Whitmore had actually left her. It wasn't just the instruments, it wasn't just the coins, it was a way of thinking. They reached the outskirts of Harlow Creek by mid-afternoon. The first person to see them was Tommy Briggs, a boy of about 12 who ran errands for the general store, and who had, in Clara's memory, never in his life been able to keep a piece of information to himself for longer than 4 minutes. Tommy stared at the wagon, at the crates in the back, at Clara sitting up front beside a man he clearly didn't recognize. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice high with surprise. "We thought you were," that is, Mr. Gerald said. "What did Mr. Gerald say, Tommy?" Clara kept her voice pleasant. Tommy's eyes moved between her and the crates and back again. "He said you'd gone off somewhere and probably wouldn't be back. He said—" The boy stopped, reconsidered. "He said not to worry about you." "That was kind of him," Clara said. "Is he in town today?" "He was at the land office this morning." "Then that's where we'll start." She felt Callum shift slightly beside her, not a movement anyone else would have noticed. Not alarm, readiness. She registered it and said nothing, but something about it steadied her in a way she couldn't entirely account for. The wagon moved through the main street of Harlow Creek, and people stopped to look. That was the nature of small towns. A wagon they didn't recognize carrying crates they couldn't identify was more interesting than anything else that had happened that week. Clara recognized faces she had known her entire life. Mrs. Holt from the seamstress shop. Pete Calloway from the feed store. Reverend Marsh, who had spoken at her father's funeral with great warmth and done nothing at all about her inheritance. She nodded to each of them as she passed. Not performing. Not performing at all. She was simply a woman driving through her own town in no hurry, with nothing to hide. They stopped in front of the land office. Clara climbed down before Callum could come around to help her, not from rudeness, but from habit. She had been getting herself down from wagons since she was 7 years old. She straightened her coat. She took one breath. And she walked through the door. Gerald Bennett was standing at the counter talking to Amos Whitfield, the county clerk. Both men turned when the door opened. Gerald's face moved through surprise, then recovery, then a particular hardening that Clara recognized as the expression of a man recalculating his position. "Clara," Gerald said, "you're back." "I am." She walked to the counter and set her satchel on it. "Hello, Amos." Amos Whitfield was a small, dry man with ink-stained fingers and the perpetual expression of someone who had seen too many disputes to be surprised by any of them. He nodded carefully. "Miss Bennett, I'd like to discuss the transfer documents," Clara said. She reached into her satchel and produced the papers Gerald had shown her 3 days ago. She set them on the counter. "Specifically, I'd like to discuss the fact that my father's property could not legally transfer to a male heir because under the Bennett family's original land grant, which was filed in 1867 under the Homestead Act, the property was listed jointly in my father's name and my name as I was the only surviving dependent." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "That's not— I have the original filing." Clara reached back into her satchel. She pulled out a folded document. "My father gave it to me 8 years ago. He kept it in his trunk. I found it 2 days before I left." She set it on the counter beside the transfer papers. "I believe if you compare the two documents, you'll find that the transfer you filed is based on an incomplete record." Amos Whitfield looked at the original filing. He looked at it for a long time. Something moved through his expression that might have been discomfort. "Gerald." Clara turned to look at her cousin directly. "I don't believe you knew about the original filing. I think someone told you the path was clear and you believed them. I'm willing to consider that." She held his gaze. "But the path is not clear, and I think you know right now that this is going to be complicated for you if you push it forward." Gerald stared at her. There was something in his face she had not expected. Something that was not entirely hostility. Something that might have been under other circumstances almost like respect. "Where have you been?" he said. 3 days in the desert, and you come back with— "With my father's original land grant," Clara said. "That's all." It was not all, but it was enough for now. Gerald looked at the documents on the counter. He looked at Clara. He looked at some point past her shoulder, and she did not turn to see, but she was aware of Callum Hayes standing in the doorway behind her, with the particular stillness of a man who is present without being a threat. I'll need time, Gerald said finally, to review this. Take whatever time you need, Clara said. I'll be at the farm, my farm. She picked up the original land grant, left the transfer documents where they were, and walked back out the door. Outside, the sunlight hit her full in the face. She stopped for just a moment on the wooden sidewalk, her hand on the doorframe, and let herself feel it. The solidity of it. The reality of what had just happened in that room. Callum had stepped back to give her space, but he was close enough that she could speak quietly. You had that filing the whole time, he said. It was not a question. My father told me where it was, she said. Before he died. He said I might need it someday. She took a breath. I didn't realize until I was packing to leave. You didn't tell me. I didn't know if I could trust you yet. She looked at him directly. I know now. Callum considered that. Nodded once. What next? Clara looked down the main street of Harlow Creek. At all the faces that had watched her pass. At the buildings she had walked past her entire life. The businesses and the homes and the church and the land office. All of it arranged around the quiet assumption that some people mattered more than others. I need to talk to someone, she said. A lawyer. And then I need to find a building. He looked at her. A building. An empty one. Something that can be converted. She glanced back at the wagon at the crates sitting in the bed. I have plans to make. What kind of plans? She thought about Nathaniel Whitmore's letter. About the passage in his journal she had read twice by the creek. About Tommy Briggs's wide eyes when he saw her wagon pull up about Mrs. Holt from the seamstress shop, pausing on the sidewalk to watch her pass. About all the people in this town who had been told their whole lives that knowledge was for other people. The kind of plans, Clara said, that take a while to build and don't fall down easy. The lawyer's name was Samuel Greer, and he operated out of a single room above the feed store with a battered desk and 2 chairs that did not match. He was 60 years old, had lived in Harlow Creek for 30 of those years, and had the particular reputation of a man who charged fair rates and did not ask you to make a decision until you understood what you were deciding. Clara had met him once at her father's side when Joseph Bennett had questions about the homestead filing. She had been 17 at the time. She was not certain Greer would remember her. He did. Clara Bennett, he said when she appeared in his doorway. He stood, which surprised her. Not many men stood when she came into a room. I heard about your father. I'm sorry. Thank you. She sat in the chair he indicated and placed the land grant on his desk. I need to know if this holds. Greer sat down and picked it up. His eyes moved carefully across it. He was the kind of reader who did not rush, and Clara sat across from him and waited with her hands folded in her lap. After 5 minutes he looked up. Where did you get this? My father left it for me. Greer looked back at the document. Joseph kept this out of the county record. He filed it, but he kept the original. And the copy in the county record, I believe it was altered, Clara said. Or misfiled, possibly with assistance. Greer's expression did not change in any dramatic way. But something shifted. Something careful and assessing came into his face. You understand what you're saying. I understand exactly what I'm saying. If you push this, Clara, you're not just pushing against your cousin. Gerald Bennett doesn't have the resources or the influence to push a transfer through that fast on his own. You'd be pushing against whoever helped him, and in this territory. Eli Crane, Clara said. Greer went still. I know, Clara said. I'm not afraid of the name. You should be, Greer said. Not unkindly, simply as a fact. Eli Crane has been the actual authority in this county for 8 years. He owns the lumber operation, 2 of the 3 largest ranches, and significant debt from half the businesses on this street. He does not lose disputes in this county, Clara. He simply doesn't. He hasn't lost a dispute, Clara said. That's different from not being able to. Greer studied her. What do you have? Clara reached back into her satchel. The land grant. My father's records, which I have already reviewed, and which show 3 years of consistent tax payment in both our names. And something else. She paused. Something I'm not ready to put on a lawyer's desk yet, but that I believe changes the nature of this argument considerably. Greer leaned back in his chair. He looked at her the way people almost never looked at Clara Bennett, like he was genuinely trying to understand who she was. "You came back from 3 days in the desert," he said slowly, "with considerably more confidence than you left with. People are noticing that." "Good," Clara said. "It will make some people nervous." "Also good." Greer looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at the land grant. Then he looked at his desk, and at the window above it, and at something outside that Clara couldn't see. "I'll file a challenge to the transfer," he said finally. "On the grounds of an incomplete record. It'll take time and it will cost you." "How much?" He named a figure. It was significant. It was not impossible. "Give me 2 weeks," Clara said. "I'll have it." Greer raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks? 2 weeks. He studied her again. Then he picked up a pen. "All right, Miss Bennett. Let's start from the beginning." She walked out of Greer's office 40 minutes later with the particular feeling of having put a stone into motion. Not a small stone. A stone that would roll through things, and that some people were not going to appreciate rolling. She stood on the landing above the feed store and looked out at the street below. Callum was waiting with the wagon. He had not come upstairs. He had simply been there when she came down, as though the interval had been nothing to him. "He'll file the challenge?" Callum asked. "He will." Clara climbed up into the wagon. "Now I need to find out what Eli Crane is actually afraid of." Callum looked at her. "Most men like that aren't afraid of anything." "Every man is afraid of something," Clara said. "What he's afraid of tells you where the leverage is." She said it with a confidence she was mostly sure about, and Callum looked at her for a moment, and then he clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved. They went to the farm. It was the first time Clara had been back since the morning Gerald arrived with his men and his papers and his pleasant certainty that she had nowhere to go. Walking through the door of her father's house hit her differently than she expected. Not devastation the way she had braced for. Something quieter and more specific. The absence of her father lived in particular places, the empty hook by the door where his coat should have been. The cold fireplace, the coffee pot, sitting on the stove in exactly the place she had left it. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Just a moment. Callum stayed outside without being asked. She would learn later that he had an instinct for that, for knowing when a person needed the solitude of a familiar space. She breathed. She let herself feel the ache of it, the realness of the house without her father in it. She let it be what it was for 30 seconds. Then she straightened, went to the window, and looked out at the land. Her land. Still hers, if Greer's challenge held. 40 acres of dry Colorado soil that her father had worked with nothing but determination, and the belief that what he built mattered. She was going to make it matter. She went back outside. Callum was standing by the wagon looking at the storage barn at the back of the property. Clara followed his gaze. "That building," she said slowly. "It's solid," Callum said. "The frame anyway. Your father maintained it." "Could it be converted?" Callum walked toward it. Clara followed. He pushed open the barn door and went inside, moving through the space with the assessing eye of someone who had built and repaired things for years. He tested the structural posts, ran his hand along the wall planks, checked the ceiling beams. "With work," he said. "What are you thinking of putting in it?" "Everything in those crates," Clara said. "The instruments, the maps, the journals." Callum turned to look at her. "Whitmore wanted a place where ordinary people could come and learn," she said. "People who are always told that learning is for other people. I know what it is to be one of those people. I know what it does to a person being told that what's in their head doesn't count for anything." She looked at the space around her. "This is the right place. I knew it when I read his letter. This is what he meant when he wrote that I'd know the place when I found it." Callum was quiet for a long moment. "You're planning to open a school." "Not exactly a school," Clara said. "A workshop. A place for people to use the instruments, to read the journals, to learn what Whitmore knew and more. Something that belongs to anyone who wants it, not just people who can afford to attend a proper institution." She looked at him. "And I'm going to use Nathaniel Whitmore's name and his documented history to make it impossible for Eli Crane to tear it down without looking like he's burning down a community monument. Callum stared at her. Something shifted in his face. That quiet, careful expression she was beginning to recognize. Something behind it that she thought might be something she wasn't quite ready to name. "You thought all of that out there in the desert," he said. "I had time to think," she said, "and a man's journals to read." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Bennet." "Clara," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. She said it anyway. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Clara." He said her name like he was deciding to keep it. "This is going to make Eli Crane very unhappy." "Yes," she agreed. "I'm counting on it. He'll push back. I know. He might come at you in ways that don't involve lawyers or documents. I know that too." She met his eyes. "Are you telling me not to do it?" "No," Callum said immediately. "I'm telling you to know what you're walking into." "I've been walking into things my whole life that other people told me I shouldn't," Clara said. "I'm comfortable with it by now." He looked at her. She looked back. The barn around them was quiet, and it smelled of old hay and dry timber, and somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted and blew a soft breath, and the afternoon light came through the gaps in the wall planks in thin, bright lines. "I'll help you," Callum said. "With the conversion, and with whatever else comes." Clara had not asked him. She noticed that he had not waited to be asked. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. The kind of quiet a person falls into when they're not trying to construct an answer, but find one. "Because what you're doing matters," he said finally. "And because your father was a good man who deserved better than what this county gave him. And because—" He stopped, reconsidered, chose a different version. "Because somebody ought to." It was not the full answer. She knew it was not the full answer, but it was honest, and she accepted it. "All right," she said. "Then we start tomorrow." The next morning the trouble came to find her before she was finished with breakfast. She heard the horse first, a single rider moving fast, pulling up hard in the yard. She was at the table with a cup of coffee and Whitmore's second journal open in front of her when the knock came. 3 sharp raps. She opened the door. The man standing on the porch was not Gerald. Not Amos Whitfield. Not anyone she had expected. He was perhaps 50 broad, with the kind of expensive coat that announced money without needing to specify how much. He held his hat in his hands, which was a courtesy, but his eyes were not courteous at all. "Miss Bennet," he said. "My name is Eli Crane." The name hit her like cold water. She kept her face neutral. "Mr. Crane." "May I come in?" Every instinct she had said no. She held the door open. "Of course." He came in and stood in her father's kitchen and looked around with the expression of a man conducting an inventory. She offered him coffee because her father had raised her to offer coffee to anyone who came through that door, regardless of her feelings about them. He declined. That told her something. "I'll be direct," he said. He did not sit, neither did she. They stood on opposite sides of her father's kitchen table and looked at each other. "You filed a legal challenge to the property transfer." "My lawyer has filed it, yes." "It will complicate things." "That's why we filed it." Crane's jaw moved slightly. "Clara, may I call you Clara?" "Miss Bennet," she said pleasantly. A pause. "Miss Bennet, I understand you're upset about the situation with your cousin. That's natural. But there are realities in this territory that—" "Mr. Crane." She said it quietly but firmly. "I'm going to stop you there. I know what you're going to say. You're going to tell me about the realities of this territory. And by that, you'll mean the realities of power and influence, and what happens to people who don't accept those realities." She looked at him directly. "I've lived in this territory for 25 years. I know the realities." He studied her. The inventory expression had shifted to something more careful. He had come here expecting a young woman who was frightened and alone and could be managed. He was revising that assessment in real time, and she could see him doing it. "What do you want?" he said. "My farm," she said. "My father's land grant upheld. The transfer documents nullified. She paused. And something else. What else? I found something in the desert this week, she said. Something that belongs to the history of this county. Nathaniel Whitmore's wagon train and his cargo, his instruments, his research, his journals. I intend to make them publicly available through a workshop on this property, something this community can use. Crane stared at her. Whitmore, he said slowly. The explorer, the inventor and educator, Clara corrected, who disappeared in 1804 with his life's work. I've recovered it. I have documentation establishing its origin and its intended purpose. The silence stretched. You can't be serious, Crane said. I am entirely serious. He looked at her, at the kitchen, at the table with the open journal, at her hands which were still, and at her face which was giving him nothing. If you make that public, he said carefully, there will be press interest. There will be attention from the territory's historical society. There will be scrutiny, Clara said. Yes, I'm counting on that. She watched him understand it, watched him see the shape of what she was doing. The legal challenge was one piece. The historical discovery was another. Together they created a situation in which moving against her became much more costly and visible than it would have been if she had simply stayed in the desert and failed. She had changed the agreement exactly the way Whitmore's journal had said. Crane was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not defeated, not yet, but recalibrated. You've thought this through, he said. I had a good teacher, Clara said, even if he died 80 years before I was born. Crane put his hat back on. A deliberate movement. A man reasserting his composure. This isn't over, Miss Bennett. I know, she said. But it started. And I think you came here hoping to stop it before it started. She walked to the door and held it open. You're too late for that, Mr. Crane. He walked out. He did not look back. Clara stood in the open doorway and watched him ride away down the road her father had built toward the main track. She stood there until he was out of sight. Then she went back to the table and picked up Whitmore's journal. Her coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Eli Crane rode away from that farm, like a man who had just discovered the opponent across the table was holding better cards than he'd been told. Clara watched until the sound of his horse faded completely. Then she sat back down, opened Whitmore's journal to the page she'd marked, and read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the particular physical aftermath of holding yourself completely still under pressure for 20 minutes when everything inside you wants to move. She pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed until the shaking stopped. She had just told Eli Crane he was too late. She needed to make sure that was actually true. Callum arrived an hour later with tools and lumber he'd collected from his own ranch, pulling up in the yard without announcement, the way he'd been doing since the desert, as though he had quietly decided his schedule now included her and hadn't felt the need to make a formal declaration about it. He took one look at her face when she came to the door and set down the lumber. Crane came, he said. This morning, early. What did he say? What men like that always say. Clara stepped back to let him in. That there are realities in this territory. That I should consider the situation carefully. She poured him coffee without asking. I told him I'd already considered it. Callum wrapped both hands around the cup. How'd he take that? He left. She sat across from him. Which means he went somewhere to think. Which means we have a window before he decides what to do next. She looked at him. How fast can you start on the barn conversion? Today, Callum said. If you'll tell me exactly what you need. She had been sketching it out in her mind since the night in the desert, when she'd first understood what Whitmore had left her. Not just the physical layout, though she'd thought through that too. The placement of the work tables, the shelving for the journals, the space needed for the larger instruments, but the shape of the thing. What it would feel like to walk into. What it would say to the people who came through the door, she told him. All of it. The words came faster than she expected, because she'd been carrying them for days, and it was a relief to put them somewhere outside her own head. Callum listened the way he did everything without interrupting, without offering premature opinions, tracking every detail with those dark eyes that missed very little. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The reading tables need to be centered," he said. "Not pushed to the walls. If they're centered, people feel like they belong in the room, instead of like they've been permitted to stand in it." Clara looked at him. It was such a specific observation, so exactly right that it surprised her. "You've thought about this kind of thing before," she said. Something moved through his expression. Brief. Not quite pain, but related to it. "My mother ran a reading circle out of our barn for 10 years, he said. "Back in Kansas before we came west. Women mostly, some men people who'd never had schooling. She always said the hardest part wasn't teaching anyone to read. The hardest part was getting them to believe they had the right to be in the room." He looked at the table. "She'd have understood what you're doing." Clara held that for a moment. "She's not alive." "No, just that. I'm sorry." "She would have liked you," he said. And then he picked up his coffee and looked away, which was Callum Hayes's version of closing a door gently rather than slamming it, and Clara understood and let it close. They were back to work within minutes. That was something else she had noticed about him. He did not let feelings stop motion. He felt things fully. She was beginning to understand that, but he did not use feeling as a reason to stop moving forward. It was a quality she recognized because she shared it, and recognizing it in someone else felt like seeing her own reflection somewhere she hadn't expected. By mid-morning, they had cleared the main floor of the barn, and Callum had begun assessing the structural work needed. Clara had started pulling the inventory she'd made in the desert, which items from Whitmore's crates were fragile, which were robust, which needed specialized storage. She was cross-referencing against the journals to understand which instruments had been in active use at the time. Whitmore lost the wagons because those would be the ones his notes could help people actually operate. Tommy Briggs appeared in the barn doorway around 11, breathing hard from running. Clara looked up from the crate she was unpacking. "Tommy." "Miss Bennett." The boy's eyes went wide at the contents of the crates, the brass fittings, the glass lenses, the rolled maps. "What is all that?" "Instruments," she said. "Scientific equipment. Do you know what a telescope is, Tommy?" "I've heard of one." "Would you like to see one?" The look on Tommy Briggs's face was worth a considerable amount. Clara carefully lifted the largest piece from the crate. A refractor telescope, compact, but beautifully made, the brass still bright under its oilskin wrappings, and held it out toward him. Tommy took a step forward, stopped. "Can I touch it?" "That's what it's for," Clara said. He touched it like it was something holy. She watched his face and thought that. That right there is what Whitmore meant. Then Tommy remembered why he'd come. "Miss Bennett, there's something happening at the land office. Mr. Whitfield called a meeting, town council and some others. Mr. Greer was seen going in." Clara set down the telescope carefully. "When?" "About an hour ago. They're still in there." She looked at Callum. He had already set down his tools. "Go," he said. "I'll keep working." "I shouldn't. You should." He gave her a look that was direct without being forceful. "Whatever they're deciding in that room, it's better decided with you in the street outside it than here." She was out the door in 2 minutes. The land office was a narrow building with a single glass-fronted window that gave onto the street. As Clara approached, she could see shapes moving inside enough bodies that the meeting was more than a quiet conversation between two men. She counted at least 6, possibly 8. She did not go in. She stood on the sidewalk opposite and waited the way her grandfather had taught her to wait actively, gathering information, reading the situation without revealing that she was reading it. Mrs. Holt from the seamstress shop came out of the shop 2 doors down and stopped when she saw Clara standing there. "Clara Bennett," the woman said. "I heard you were back." "I'm back," Clara agreed. Martha Holt was 60 years old, with a sharp mind and the particular combination of kindness and practicality that made her the person most people in Harlow Creek went to when they needed something managed without drama. She had been a friend of Clara's mother once, before Clara's mother died. She looked at Clara now with an assessment that was not unkind. "You've stirred something up," Martha said. "I've filed a legal challenge to an unjust property transfer," Clara said. If that stirs something up, I think that says more about what the territory is used to than about what I've done." Martha looked at the land office window. Eli Crane arrived at the county commissioner's house at 7 this morning. Woke the man up. She paused. That's not something Eli Crane does unless he's worried. "Good," Clara said. "He should be." Martha studied her for a long moment. "What did you find out there in that desert?" The question was direct enough that Clara looked at her properly. Martha Holt's eyes were serious. Not gossipy, not prying, genuinely asking. "Something that was waiting to be found," Clara said. "And you're going to use it." "I already am." Martha was quiet. Then, "Your mother would be proud of you." She said it simply without sentiment as a statement of fact. And then she went back into her shop, leaving Clara alone on the sidewalk. Clara stood there and felt the words settle into her chest like something warm. She had not been expecting that. She had not known how much she needed it until she heard it. She stood up straighter, and she kept watching the land office window. The meeting broke up 30 minutes later. The men came out in ones and twos, most of them with the particular purposeful look of people who had just been asked to do something they weren't entirely comfortable with. Amos Whitfield came out last alone and stopped when he saw Clara across the street. He crossed to her. "Miss Bennett," he said. He lowered his voice, though the street had mostly cleared. "Mr. Greer's challenge has been formally received." "I know that. There will be a hearing, 3 weeks from Thursday." "Also expected." Whitfield looked at his hands, then at her. He was a small, dry man, and for a moment he looked smaller and drier than usual. "There is pressure," he said carefully, "from certain parties to expedite a resolution in favor of the existing transfer documents." Clara looked at him steadily. "Are you warning me?" "I am informing you," Whitfield said with the particular precision of a man choosing every word, "of the current procedural environment." "I appreciate the information," Clara said. "I would also like to inform you of something, Amos." She kept her voice perfectly level. "I have in my possession documentary evidence of a significant historical discovery made on Colorado Territory soil. I have already drafted a letter to the Territorial Historical Society in Denver describing that discovery and its current location, which is my family's property. I intend to send that letter by tomorrow's post." She paused. "It would be a very interesting moment for the county land records to come under scrutiny from Denver at the same time as a high-profile historical matter is drawing attention to this specific area." Whitfield went very still. "I'm not threatening you, Amos," Clara said. "I'm informing you of the procedural environment." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not conversion exactly, but recalculation. The same thing she'd seen happen to Gerald. The same thing she'd watched happen to Crane. "3 weeks from Thursday," he said again. Then he walked away. Clara stood on the sidewalk and felt the morning move around her. The town of Harlow Creek going about its business. Horses and wagons, and the sound of the blacksmith 3 streets over working his anvil. People who had known her all her life, passing on the other side of the street without stopping. Some of them glancing at her with the particular curiosity of people who have started to revise an opinion but haven't finished yet. She went back to the farm. Callum had made substantial progress on the barn. He'd opened up the south wall to improve light-reinforced 3 of the main ceiling beams and begun framing out the space for the work tables. He worked with the focused efficiency of a man who had done construction work before. Not for show, but as a real and practical skill, and watching him work was in its own way instructive. The economy of it, the way nothing he did was wasted. "Hearings in 3 weeks, she told him. "Enough time," he said, not looking up from the beam he was measuring. "Whitfield warned me there's pressure to resolve in Crane's favor." "Expected." I told him about the letter to Denver. Callum looked up at that. "You haven't written it yet." "I wrote it this morning," she said. "Before Crane came. It goes out tomorrow." She saw something in his face. "You think that's too aggressive." "I think it's exactly aggressive enough," he said. "I was just—" He paused. Chose words. "I keep being surprised by you." "Stop being surprised," she said. "It'll be more efficient." He laughed, quiet, sudden, entirely genuine, and turned back to his measuring. And Clara went back to her inventory, and for a while the barn was full of nothing but the sounds of work, which was one of her favorite kinds of full. The trouble came back that afternoon in a shape she hadn't anticipated. It came in the form of her cousin Gerald, which she had expected. But it came with something unexpected attached to it. Gerald came alone on foot, without any of the papers or the pleasant certainty he'd carried the last time. He knocked on the farmhouse door, like a man who was not entirely sure he was welcome. Which was, Clara thought, perhaps the most accurate self-assessment Gerald Bennett had ever made. She opened the door. He looked tired. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the sharp-faced, smooth-coated cousin who had stood in her yard 3 days ago announcing her dispossession. This was a man who had not slept well and knew it. "Clara," he said. She stepped back and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Crane had stood that morning, and declined her coffee, and she poured him a cup without asking. He accepted it, wrapped both hands around it, did not speak for a moment. "I didn't know about the original filing," he said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," Clara said. And she did. "But you knew the transfer was fast. You knew it didn't involve me." "They told me." He stopped, tried again. "Eli Crane told me the legal path was clear, that with no will and no male involvement in the property records, the transfer was straightforward." He looked at the table. "I should have looked closer." "Yes," Clara said. "You should have." Gerald was quiet. Then, "He's not going to let this go easily, Clara. You understand that. Whatever you found out there in the desert, whatever you think you have, Crane has been operating in this territory for 8 years, and he doesn't lose." "I know that's what people believe," Clara said. "It's not just belief. Gerald." She said it firmly, not unkindly. "Why did you come here?" He looked at her. Something moved through his face. Something that might have been shame if Gerald Bennett was capable of it, and she was revising her opinion on that. "Because he told me this morning that if the legal challenge goes through, any costs or complications become my responsibility. That the arrangement between us is dissolved." He put down the coffee cup. "He used me to start something, and now he's preparing to step back from it and leave me holding the legal exposure." Clara looked at him carefully. "And you came to me." "You're the only person in this situation who has any reason to care what happens to me," Gerald said. "Which I understand is not saying much given—" He gestured vaguely at everything. "Given all of it." Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about her father, who had believed in fair dealing even with people who didn't deserve it. She thought about what Whitmore had written. "The task is not to overpower the men at the top. The task is to change the agreement of the people at the bottom." Gerald was not the top of this. He had never been the top. "What do you know," she said slowly, "about how the original transfer was filed? Who specifically prepared the documents? Who directed Amos Whitfield?" Gerald's eyes sharpened. He understood what she was asking. "You want Crane's name on the documents?" "I want whatever names are actually on the documents," she said. "I want whoever did this to own what they did. If that's only you, then it's only you. But I don't think it's only you." A long pause. "There's a secondary set of paperwork," Gerald said. "Crane had his lawyer prepare a supplemental filing last year, establishing preferred claim on several properties, including your father's contingent on the owner dying without a clear male heir. Your father's name was on a list." He met her eyes. "I didn't know your name was off the original filing, but I knew your father was on a list." Clara heard that, heard the weight of it. Her father's name on a list in a lawyer's office prepared a year before his death. Her father, who had fed his horses before he'd asked about anything else, who had pressed a map into her hands without knowing what it would mean. She breathed. "Can you get me access to that filing?" she said. "It's in Crane's lawyer's office," Gerald said. "Harlan Mew. He keeps everything locked." "But it exists." "It exists." Clara stood up, went to the window. Outside, she could see Callum working on the barn, a steady and reliable shape in the afternoon, and the sight of him grounded her in the way that had become without her quite noticing necessary. "Here is what I can offer you, Gerald," she said without turning around. "If that filing exists and you can help me access it, I will not name you as a primary actor in my legal challenge. I will tell Greer that you were directed by Crane and that you were given incomplete information." She turned. "That is not nothing. That might be the difference between exposure and distance for you when this unravels." Gerald looked at her. "You're certain it's going to unravel?" "I'm certain I'm going to make it unravel," she said. "Whether you help me or not." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the sound of Callum's hammer rang in the afternoon. "There's a meeting tomorrow night," Gerald said finally. "Crane, his lawyer, the county commissioner, 2 of the council members. Monthly thing at Crane's lumber office. I've been invited." He looked at his hands. "I could be elsewhere. Leave a door unlocked." Clara held his gaze. "Which door?" "Mew's office is on the 2nd floor of the lumber building," Gerald said. "Side entrance. There's a key under the 3rd step. Mew keeps his files in a cabinet behind the main desk unlocked. He relies on the building security rather than individual locks." Clara registered all of it, stored it carefully. "Tomorrow night." "They meet at 8, Gerald said. "Meeting runs 2 hours at least. You'd have time." He stood up, put on his hat, looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on Gerald Bennett's face before or hadn't noticed. Something almost like regret. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the farm. About your father." He said it plainly, without decoration. "I know," Clara said, and she meant it. He left. She stood at the window and watched him walk down the road, a thinner and quieter version of the man who had stood in her yard 3 days ago, believing he had already won. She was still standing there when Callum came to the door, tool belt in hand, checking in before calling it a day. He took one look at her face. "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Gerald's visit, the list, Harlan Mew's office, the meeting tomorrow night. Callum listened. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. "You're going in tomorrow night," he said. It was not a question. "I am." "I'm going with you." "Callum." "Clara." He said it the way she'd started saying his name, like a decision. "If something goes wrong in that building, you need someone outside, or inside. Either way, you need someone who knows where you are." His jaw was set. "That's not negotiable." She looked at him. At the certainty in him, which was not aggression or control. It was something else, something that came from a place she was still mapping in him, still learning the geography of. The place where his mother's barn reading circle lived, and his grandfather's stories about Whitmore's wagon, and the scar on his chin that she had not yet found the right moment to ask about. "All right," she said. He nodded, looked at the barn. "I'll finish the north wall tomorrow morning. We can go in the evening." "Callum." He turned. "Why do you have a wagon with you when you go out to check strays?" she said. She had been carrying that question since the desert, and she wanted the real answer. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that preceded truth. "I've known about your grandfather's map since I was 12, he said. "My grandfather told me the same story he told Eli. Told me that one day someone in the Bennett family was going to go looking, and when they did, they might need help hauling." He paused. "I've been keeping a wagon hitched on long rides for 6 years, just in case." Clara stared at him. 6 years, she said. "Your grandfather was a very convincing storyteller," Callum said. She did not know whether to laugh or to feel something quieter and more significant. She did both, which surprised her, and Callum Hayes watched it happen with an expression that was open in a way. His face wasn't always open, and the afternoon light lay across the yard between them, and neither of them moved. "Go home," she said finally. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he put his hat back on and walked to his horse, and she watched him go, and when he was gone, she stood alone in the yard and pressed her hand flat against the doorframe of her father's house. Her house. She was going to keep it. She went back inside, sat at the table with Whitmore's third journal, read for an hour, drank cold coffee, thought about lists and locked offices and men who built their power on the assumption that no one would look too closely. Someone was about to look. The next morning brought the first real defection. Thomas Reed, the blacksmith, who operated the forge on the east end of Harlow Creek, appeared at the farm before 7. He was a large, quiet man with forearms like bundled rope and the particular dignity of someone who had learned his worth through work rather than declaration. Clara had known him in the peripheral way you knew everyone in a small town. His face at the market, his name attached to good ironwork, his wife at church. Nothing more. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the work Callum had done, and at the crates of Whitmore's equipment, and at Clara, who was eating a biscuit and reviewing the structural sketches she'd made the night before. "I heard what you're building," he said. "News travels fast here," Clara said. "Come in." He came in, looked at the telescope on the table, looked at the rolled maps, looked at the brass instruments still in their crates. "My boy can't read," Thomas Reed said. "He's 14. I never had the schooling to teach him, and there's no teacher in this town that's taken interest." He looked at Clara. "If you're building what people are saying you're building, I'd like to help. I can work iron. Whatever you need made or fixed, I can do it for cost." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then, "Do you know what Nathaniel Whitmore's journals say about the proper base mount for a refractor telescope?" Reed shook his head. "Sit down," she said. "I'll show you." He sat. She showed him. And within 20 minutes, Thomas Reed was leaning over the journal with his big scarred hands spread on the table, reading slowly, carefully tracing his finger under the words, the way a man does when reading his work. But the work is worth it. And the expression on his face was the same one Tommy Briggs had worn when he touched the telescope. Clara thought this is what it looks like when something that belongs to people is given back to them. By mid-morning, Martha Holt had sent her nephew with a message saying she had fabric she could spare for wall hangings if the workshop needed them. By midday, the wife of the feed store owner had appeared with a pie and an offer to help organize the journals once they were cataloged. By early afternoon, Reverend Marsh had stopped by awkwardly apologetically and asked if there was anything the church's community fund might contribute to a project of local historical significance. Each of them was small. Each of them was individual. But together, they were the shape of something shifting. Clara thought about Whitmore's journal. The task is not to overpower the men at the top. The task is to change the agreement of the people at the bottom. The people of Harlow Creek were beginning to change their agreement. She did not have time to fully absorb it because there was the night ahead and what the night required. But she felt it. She felt it in the way she had felt the hollow sound of the shovel hitting the wagon in the desert. Recognition. Confirmation. The sense of something long buried beginning finally to surface. She went back to work and waited for evening. At 7:30. Clara and Callum moved through the side streets of Harlow Creek in the full dark, moving quickly and quietly. He had said almost nothing since he arrived, which she had learned to read, not as distance, but as focus, the way he concentrated before anything that required precision. The lumber building was the largest structure on the north end of town, a square building that smelled of fresh-cut wood and old oil. The meeting was already in progress. She could hear the low sound of men's voices from the main floor as they went to the side entrance. Third step. She crouched, ran her fingers under the lip of the riser. The key was there. She looked at Callum. He nodded. She unlocked the door. The second floor was dark and still, and smelled of paper and ink. She moved by feel to the main desk. The cabinet behind it. The files hanging in careful order. She found the supplemental filing in the third drawer. She opened it. And what she found inside was not just the list Gerald had described. What she found was a document that changed everything. A deed. Not contingent. Not supplemental. A deed to the Bennett property already fully executed, dated 6 months ago, bearing the county commissioner's official seal and Harlan Mew's signature. And at the bottom, in the confident hand of a man who had never expected anyone to see it, Eli Crane. Clara stood in the dark office with the document in her hands and understood fully for the first time the complete shape of what had been done. Her father had not been on a list of contingencies. Her father had been the target of a fraud that had been planned, documented, and executed a full 6 months before he died. Her hands were not shaking this time. She folded the document, put it inside her coat, beside Whitmore's letter, which had lived there since the desert. She went back to the door. Callum was exactly where she'd left him, watching the stairs, and when she appeared, he read her face in the dark without needing light. "You found something," he said. "I found everything," she said. They moved fast through the dark streets, not running but close to it, and neither of them spoke until they were back inside the farmhouse with the door bolted and the lamp lit low. Clara laid the document on the kitchen table. Callum leaned over it. "Read it once. Read it again." When he straightened up, his jaw was tight and his eyes were doing something controlled and deliberate, the way a man looks when he is deciding how angry he is allowed to be. "6 months ago," he said. 6 months before my father died," Clara said. "This deed was executed while my father was still alive, still working that land, still paying his taxes." She pressed her finger against the date. "Eli Crane decided this property was his before my father was even in the ground. He had his lawyer write a deed to transfer ownership the moment Joseph Bennett stopped breathing, and he had the county commissioner's seal already on it." Callum looked at her. "This is fraud, Clara. This isn't a paperwork dispute. This is criminal fraud against your father's estate. I know what it is. If this reaches a territorial court—" "It will reach a territorial court," she said. "It will reach every court I can get it in front of." She pulled out a chair and sat. Her mind was already moving fast, arranging pieces. "Greer needs to see this tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. It's past 9. I know what time it is." Callum looked at her for one moment. Then he picked up his hat. "I'll get him." He was out the door before she could say anything else. Clara sat alone at the table with the document in front of her, and Nathaniel Whitmore's letter pressing against her ribs from inside her coat, and her father's kitchen around her, smelling of old coffee and pine wood, and 40 years of a good man's ordinary life. She thought about her father walking out every morning before dawn to check the horses. Thought about the way he'd pressed the location of that land grant into her memory, like a man who knew someone might need it someday. Thought about the careful, quiet intelligence of a person who had been underestimated his entire life and had worked around that underestimation without bitterness, without performance, simply by knowing more than the people underestimating him ever suspected. Her father had known something was wrong with this territory long before it came for him. He had been protecting her, preparing her. The land grant, the instructions on where to find it, the trunk with Eli's map. Joseph Bennett had been building her a set of tools for a fight he knew was coming and had not wanted to frighten her with. Clara put her head in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Let herself feel that. The fullness of it. The grief and the love and the particular fierce pride of understanding who her father had really been beneath the quiet and the patience. Then she lifted her head, straightened her back, and began writing. She had a letter half finished to the territorial court clerk in Denver when Callum returned with Samuel Greer. The lawyer was in his coat, but not his vest, his hair uncombed, which told her Callum had knocked insistently. Greer came through this door with the expression of a man already awake enough to read. An emergency, took one look at Clara's face, and sat down at the table without being asked. She put the document in front of him. He read it the way he'd read the land grant, carefully without rushing. But this time, halfway through, she watched something change in his face. A tightening. A shift from professional caution into something that was quietly anger. He set it down. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Does it matter?" He looked at her. "It might matter in terms of how we present it. I found it in a place where it should not have been hidden," Clara said carefully. "In a filing that was never entered into the public record. A filing that was deliberately withheld." Greer absorbed that. "I won't ask more than that tonight." He looked at the document again. "This is a pre-executed deed, signed, sealed, dated 6 months prior to your father's death, bearing Crane's name, his lawyer's name, and the county commissioner's seal." He was quiet for a moment. "This is not a civil matter, Clara. This is evidence of conspiracy to defraud a property owner of his estate." "That's what I said," Callum said from across the room. "It's worse than fraud," Greer continued. He was building towards something. She could hear it. If Crane had this deed prepared 6 months before your father died, and your father died unexpectedly. Without previous illness, there will be questions about the nature of that death that have never been asked. He looked up at her. You understand what I'm suggesting? The room went very still. Clara had not let herself go there. She had not let herself follow that particular road, because it led somewhere too dark to visit without being certain. But Greer was saying it now, and Callum had gone absolutely motionless across the room, and the document sat on the table between them like something alive. My father died in his sleep, Clara said. The doctor said his heart. Yes, Greer said. The doctor said his heart. He let that sit. I'm not making an accusation. I'm telling you that when this document becomes public, other people will ask that question, louder than I'm asking it. Clara breathed. Can you prove the challenge on the existing evidence? Yes, Greer said without hesitation. This document alone invalidates the transfer. A pre-executed deed proves intent to defraud before the triggering event. Combined with the original land grant showing your co-ownership, the case is not complicated. He paused. It is, however, very dangerous. You understand that Eli Crane will not accept this quietly. He's not going to have the option of quiet, Clara said. The letter to Denver goes out tomorrow morning. The Historical Society letter goes with it. She looked at Greer directly. When Denver starts paying attention to Nathaniel Whitmore's wagon train and Harlow Creek's connection to that discovery, every action taken in this county in the last year will be subject to outside scrutiny. Crane relies on this territory being too remote and too quiet for anyone outside it to care what happens here. She tapped the document. This ends that. Greer looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was revising something. Some earlier version of who he had thought she was. I'll file an emergency injunction in the morning, he said, freezing the property transfer pending investigation of the new evidence. He folded the document carefully and tucked it inside his own coat. I'll need you at my office at 7. I'll be there at 6:30, she said. He almost smiled. Then he nodded to Callum, picked up his hat, and let himself out. The kitchen was quiet after he left. Clara sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at nothing in particular. You all right? Callum said. No, she said, just that, honest. He crossed the room and sat down across from her. Did not touch her. Did not offer comfort in the form of words that would be insufficient. He simply sat there, present, solid, his dark eyes steady on her face, and she found that it was exactly what she needed, not to be fixed, not to be reassured, but to have someone sit with her in the room where her father had lived and be real and close and awake. He left me everything I needed, she said finally. My father, the land grant, the map, the instructions on where to find them. He knew. She paused. He knew something was wrong with this county, and he prepared me for it without telling me. Because telling me would have meant telling me he was afraid, and he didn't want that for me. Callum said nothing, but his hands folded on the table between them moved slightly toward her. Not touching, just closer. I was so quiet, Clara said. So steady. And the whole time he was carrying this knowing someone had their eye on his land, knowing he couldn't fight it directly, finding ways to protect me that I wouldn't even understand until after he was gone. She looked at Callum. That is a very particular kind of love, the kind that works in the dark. Callum looked at her. The lamp between them was low, throwing warm light across the table, and his face in it was open. In a way she had come to understand was not his default, was something he allowed only in specific circumstances, and she was learning the shape of those circumstances. Your father knew what he had in you, Callum said. He didn't need to be afraid for you. He just needed to make sure you had what you needed. Clara looked at her hands. He could have told me. Some things you have to find yourself before you believe them, Callum said. If he'd told you, you might have spent years fighting on ground someone else chose. Finding it yourself, you chose your own ground. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's very wise. My grandfather said it, Callum said. About the map. He said your grandfather understood that the person who found that wagon needed to find it on their own terms, or it wouldn't mean the same thing. Clara looked at him. Your grandfather and my grandfather planned this. The corner of his mouth moved. I reckon they might have. 2 old men, Clara said slowly, arranging things for people who weren't born yet. The best kind of long game, Callum said. She laughed, brief and real, and the sound of it in her father's kitchen at 9:30 in the evening, with a fraudulent deed in the custody of her lawyer, and an emergency injunction being prepared for morning, was the most alive she had felt in a month. She went to bed an hour later and slept without dreams, which was its own kind of mercy. Morning came fast. She was at Greer's office at 6:25. He was already there, already working the emergency injunction spread across his desk in draft form, alongside 3 supporting documents he had pulled from the county filing archive during what had clearly been a very early start to his day. "Sit," he said. "Read this. Tell me if I've missed anything." She read. She had not missed anything. She suggested 2 additions that Greer absorbed without argument, which told her he respected her enough not to perform disagreement for form's sake. The injunction was filed at the county clerk's office at 7:15, before Amos Whitfield had finished his first cup of coffee. Whitfield looked at it, looked at Greer, looked at Clara. His expression was complex. "This will require formal acknowledgement from the county commissioner," he said. "I'm aware," Greer said. "File it. The procedural obligation is yours. Amos, regardless of how uncomfortable the commissioner finds it." Whitfield looked at Clara one more time. She met his eyes and held them. He stamped the filing. The letters to Denver went out on the Morning Post, both of them, and Clara stood at the post office window and watched the mail rider take them, and felt the particular finality of an action that cannot be untaken. Good. She wanted things that could not be untaken. She went back to the farm. Thomas Reed was already in the barn, working on the iron mounting base for the telescope, his boy beside him, holding tools, and watching with the focused attention of a young person encountering something new. Callum was up on a ladder working the ceiling beams. Martha Holt had arrived with her nephew and 3 yards of dark blue cotton. The feed store owner's wife had come back with her sister and a pot of something that smelled like venison stew. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at all of it. A week ago she had stood in this same yard and watched her cousin arrive with strange men, and the confident posture of someone who had already decided how this story ended. The story had not ended the way he planned. Miss Bennet. Thomas Reed's boy had appeared at her elbow. He was 14 broad like his father, with the same careful dignity. He was holding one of Whitmore's smaller journals, the one with the astronomical charts. "My pa said I could look at this while he works. There's something in here I don't understand, and I was wondering." "What don't you understand?" Clara said. He opened to a page. "These marks, around the star drawings. Are these numbers?" "They're coordinates," Clara said. "Come here, I'll show you what they mean." She spent 20 minutes explaining celestial coordinates to Thomas Reed's son, and he absorbed it with the focused, hungry attention of a mind that had been waiting for something to actually chew on. By the end of it, he was asking questions. She hadn't prompted making connections. She hadn't suggested turning the journal pages with the urgency of someone who has just discovered that the world is larger than the boundaries of a small Colorado town. She thought about Nathaniel Whitmore dying at 78, with his life's work buried in the desert, about what he had believed that this moment existed somewhere in the future, that someone would sit in a barn in Colorado territory and explain celestial coordinates to a blacksmith's son who was hungry for something bigger than the life he'd been told was his only option. She thought she understood now why Whitmore had believed it, because it was simply true. The need had always been there. It just needed someone to build the door. The trouble arrived at 2 in the afternoon. It did not arrive as Eli Crane. That was the first surprise. It arrived as the county commissioner, a man named Douglas Albright, who was 65 years old and had held his office for 16 years and had, to Clara's knowledge, never once appeared at any private property without an official reason. He arrived with 2 men. Clara did not recognize, not deputies, not clerks, something less defined, and he had the particular expression of a man who has been sent to do something he is not comfortable with and has decided to do it efficiently and leave as fast as possible. He stopped at the barn doorway, took in the people, the instruments, Callum on his ladder, Thomas Reed at his ironwork, Martha Holt pinning fabric to the wall, the blacksmith's boy with the journal. His expression shifted, just slightly. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Commissioner Albright." She walked to him, did not invite him in. "This is a surprise." "I need to speak with you," he said. His voice was low, which told her he didn't particularly want the room to hear. "Privately." Clara looked at him, looked at the two men behind him, looked back at him. "Anything you need to say to me, Commissioner, you can say in front of my neighbors," she said at regular volume. "I don't have private business with county officials, just public business." Albright's jaw tightened. She felt the barn go quiet. Not the absence of activity, but the particular quality of people who are still moving but have turned their attention fully to the conversation at the door. "An injunction has been filed," Albright said. "I'm aware. I was present when it was filed. It creates complications for pending county business." "I imagine it does." She kept her voice pleasant. "What specifically would you like me to do about that, Commissioner?" He studied her. The two men behind him were studying the barn. She could see them registering the instruments, the people, the scope of what was being built here, and she could see them understanding that they had expected to arrive at a frightened young woman alone on a farm, and had found something considerably more established. "The injunction will be contested," Albright said. "Of course it will." Clara nodded. "That's what courts are for. I look forward to the process." She paused. "I should let you know, Commissioner, that the Territorial Historical Society in Denver received a letter this morning regarding the Whitmore wagon train discovery. I expect they'll be sending a representative to assess the artifacts within a few weeks. It would be an unfortunate time for any county business to be found irregular." She tilted her head. "Wouldn't you say—" Albright was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to mean several things. "Your father," he said suddenly. Unexpected. His voice had shifted into something that surprised her, something less official. "Joseph was a decent man." Clara looked at him. "I knew him," Albright said. "Not well, but enough. He brought me a concern once about some of the property records in this county, about patterns he'd noticed." He paused. "I didn't act on it." The barn was very quiet now. Everyone in it was listening and not pretending otherwise. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara said. Albright looked at his hat, which he was holding in his hands. "Because a pre-executed deed dated 6 months before a man dies is not something I knew about. And when Samuel Greer showed me that document this morning, He stopped. "It is not something I would have permitted." "But you didn't know," Clara said. "Because someone made sure you didn't." "Yes," Albright said. "Just that. Commissioner." Clara kept her voice even. "Are you telling me you intend to cooperate with the investigation?" Howe was quiet for a long moment. The two men behind him were very still. "I'm telling you," he said slowly, "that the county commissioner's seal on that deed was affixed without my authorization. I am telling you that I intend to state that in writing, and I am telling you that I believe the injunction should stand pending full review." He looked at her. "I'm also telling you that Eli Crane is going to know I'm here within the hour. So whatever you need to do in the next 24 hours, you should do it fast." Clara stared at him. Douglas Albright, County Commissioner for 16 years, put his hat back on. "Your father," he said again, "deserved better than what happened to him. And so did you." He nodded once. "Good day, Miss Bennett." He turned and walked back toward his horse, and the two men followed him, and Clara stood in the barn doorway and watched them go. Behind her, the barn was still. Then Thomas Reed said quietly, "Well, I did not expect that." "Neither did I," Clara said. She turned. Everyone in the barn was looking at her. Callum had come down from his ladder. Martha Holt had her hands folded in front of her. The blacksmith's boy was still holding the journal, but his eyes were on Clara's face. "Keep working," Clara said. "Everything keeps moving." She looked at Callum. "I need to get to Greer right now. The commissioner's statement needs to be recorded today before Crane gets to him." Callum was already reaching for his coat. "I'll drive." "Thomas." She looked at Reed. "Can you stay here? Keep the work going." "I'll stay," Reed said. He was not a man who needed things explained at length. "Go." She went. Greer's office again for the third time in as many days. And this time Greer met them at the door because the commissioner's clerk had already sent word that Albright was coming. They had 20 minutes before Albright arrived. Greer used them to prepare a formal affidavit template that could be completed and witnessed on the spot. Albright arrived alone, without the two men. He sat down, read the affidavit, made 2 corrections to the language in his careful official hand, and signed it. Greer witnessed it, dated it, added his seal. When it was done, Albright looked at Clara. "He'll try to discredit me," he said. "He'll say I'm covering myself." "Let him," Clara said. An affidavit from the county commissioner, combined with a pre-executed fraudulent deed, combined with a federal historical claim on the property in question, combined with a territorial court injunction, is not a case that discrediting one witness resolves. She met his eyes. "You did the right thing." He stood, picked up his hat. "I should have done it sooner," he said. He left. Greer set down pen and looked at Clara with an expression that had moved over the past several days, from careful professional assessment to something that was closer to frank admiration. "You have," he said, "in 6 days, assembled a case that most lawyers would require 6 months to build." "I had good material to work with," Clara said. "You had a fraudulent deed and a historical discovery," Greer said. "The architecture you built around them was yours." Callum, standing by the window, said nothing, but she could feel him listening, could feel the quality of his attention warm and specific, the way she was learning to feel it across rooms, the way it had started to feel like something she oriented toward without deciding to. She did not examine that feeling yet. There was too much to do, but she did not dismiss it either. She filed it carefully, the way she filed everything important, in a place she would return to when the time was right. The next 72 hours moved fast, and then faster. The Territorial Historical Society sent a telegraph the morning after the letters arrived in Denver. Not a letter back, a telegraph, which meant the discovery had been treated as urgent. The message was brief and formal, and stated that a representative would arrive within 10 days to assess the Whitmore artifacts. That telegraph, which Greer made certain was seen by the right people, changed the temperature of Harlow Creek's conversations noticeably. Gerald appeared at the farm again, this time with a written statement of his own. Prepared, he said, by a lawyer in the next county, someone outside Crane's influence. The statement detailed what Gerald knew of Crane's approach to him, the timeline of events, and the specific claims Crane had made about the legality of the transfer. It was not exculpatory exactly, but it was honest in a way that cost Gerald something, and Clara accepted it and forwarded it to Greer without comment. Crane himself went quiet, which was in its own way louder than anything he could have said. A quiet Eli Crane meant a calculating Eli Crane, which meant the next move was coming from an unexpected direction. It came from Harlan Mew. The lawyer appeared at Clara's door 4 days after the injunction filing at 7 in the morning, without Gerald, and without Crane, and without any of the official machinery Clara had been watching for. He was a thin man with a nervous quality to his movements that he usually covered with professional formality. The formality was absent this morning. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'd like to speak with you." She looked at him. "Is Eli Crane sending you?" "No," Mew said. "He doesn't know I'm here." Clara held the door open. He sat, turned his hat in his hands, looked at the table, not at her. "The deed," he said. "In my office." "Yes, I prepared it," he said. "Under instruction. Crane told me it was a prearranged agreement with your father. That Joseph Bennett had verbally agreed to sell the property, and that the deed was simply being prepared in advance of the formal transaction." He looked up. "I should have required written confirmation from your father. I know that." "You should have," Clara agreed. "I am prepared," Mew said carefully, "to provide a sworn statement to that effect. That I prepared the deed under false representation. That I was told your father had agreed to the sale." He paused. "I am not prepared to, I cannot." He stopped. "You can't implicate Crane by name," Clara said. "I can describe the instruction I received," he said. "Without attribution. A sworn description of what I was told. What I was asked to do." Clara studied him. He was frightened. She could see that clearly. Harlan Mew had spent 20 years in Eli Crane's orbit, and he understood better than most what Crane did to people who moved against him. But he had come here, on his own, before 7 in the morning. "Why?" she said. "Not the reason you're going to tell Greer, the real reason." Mew was quiet, his hand stilled on his hat. "Your father came to me once," he said. "About a year ago. He had questions about property records, about his land grant." He looked at the table. "I told him everything was in order, because I thought it was." He paused. "I found out afterward that the filing Crane had instructed me to handle had been altered before it reached the county record. I wasn't told what happened to the copy I prepared." He had not known. He had been used the same way Gerald had been used, handed incomplete information kept in a lane, given enough to be complicit without being fully aware. "My father came to you for help," Clara said, "and you gave him the best answer you had." "I gave him an answer based on false information I'd been provided," Mew said. "You." Clara looked at him for a long moment. At this thin, nervous man who had spent his career in the shadow of a powerful one, and had come to her door at 7 in the morning, because something in him had decided that the balance of what he owed had shifted. "All right," she said. "I'll have Greer contact you today." He stood. "Miss Bennett." He stopped at the door. "The meeting the other night when his office was—" He looked at his hat. The filing cabinet was unlocked. It was always unlocked. Harlan Mew's files. He said his own name like it belonged to a stranger. "I unlocked it before I went to the meeting." Clara went still. He had left the cabinet unlocked deliberately. He had known someone might come. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked away. Clara stood at the door for a moment after he left. Then she went inside, sat down at her father's table, and pressed both hands flat against the wood. The case that had seemed like an uphill fight 6 days ago had become piece by piece something else entirely. Not through force, not through a direct confrontation, she had no resources to win, but through the slow, patient work of changing what people had agreed to. The agreement was changing, person by person, choice by choice. And in 3 days, a representative from the Territorial Historical Society in Denver would arrive in Harlow Creek, and the story of what had been done to Clara Bennett and to her father's land would stop being a local secret and become something that could not be contained by county borders anymore. She was almost there. She picked up Whitmore's 4th journal. Read until the light changed. Felt her father's house around her solid and warm and still hers. And somewhere across town, in the large, comfortable office, where he had conducted 8 years of unchallenged authority, Eli Crane was sitting with the understanding that everything he had built was beginning very quietly to come apart, and that the person taking it apart was a 25-year-old woman from a 40-acre farm whom everyone had once agreed was nothing. He should have listened more carefully to what the agreements in this town were actually built on. Clara Bennett had. The representative from the Territorial Historical Society arrived on a Tuesday 3 days ahead of schedule, which told Clara that her letter had not been filed away to wait its turn. It had been read immediately, taken seriously, and acted upon. His name was Edmund Ferris. He was perhaps 50, compact and precise, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent 30 years in academic and governmental institutions and had learned to carry authority quietly rather than loudly. He arrived alone without staff, which she respected. He shook her hand at the farmhouse door, the way a man shakes hands with a colleague, not with a young woman he was prepared to condescend to. "Miss Bennett," he said, "your letter was extraordinary. I'd like to see everything." "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." She took him to the barn first. By then the conversion was nearly complete. Callum had finished the main structural work 4 days earlier, and Thomas Reed had installed the iron mounting base for the telescope, and Martha Holt's dark blue cotton hung along the south wall, and the work tables stood centered in the room exactly as Callum had said they should, so that people felt like they belonged there rather than like they were being tolerated. Ferris walked in and stopped. He looked at the instruments arranged on the tables, at the journals cataloged and organized by date on the shelving Callum had built along the north wall, at the maps mounted carefully on backing boards Clara had made herself from materials in her father's woodshop, at the telescope assembled and positioned for use, its brass fittings catching the morning light. He walked to the nearest journal, opened it, read for a moment, set it down and picked up another. He did this for 10 minutes without speaking. Clara stood back and let him work. She had learned from her grandfather and from Whitmore's own example that the best thing you could do for a serious person examining something serious was to stay out of their way. "These are genuine," Ferris said finally. He was not asking. "Yes. The instruments are consistent with Whitmore's documented work from the 1790s. The journals, the handwriting samples we have on record from his correspondence with the Philadelphia Natural Science Society." He turned. "How did you find the wagon?" She told him. The map. Her grandfather's instructions. The desert. Callum and the East Approach. The oilskin wrappings that had protected everything for 80 years. Ferris listened with his full attention. When she finished, he said, "Your grandfather knew about this. He was a surveyor. He'd found evidence of the wagon train in the 1840s, but couldn't extract the cargo alone. He kept the map for 40 years, waiting for the right moment." She paused. "Or the right person." Ferris looked at her, at the barn, at everything she had built in 9 days from materials and will, and the conviction that Nathaniel Whitmore's work deserved to exist in the world. "What you've done here," he said carefully, "is not just preservation. You've created a functional educational facility around a nationally significant collection." He paused. "The Historical Society has resources, preservation grants, documentation funding. A formal designation as a protected historical site would also provide legal protection," Clara said. "Considerable legal protection," Ferris confirmed. He met her eyes. "I understand there are property disputes currently in process." "There are." "A federal designation as a site of national historical significance would supersede most county-level property actions," Ferris said. "Any attempt to demolish, seize, or transfer the property containing a federally designated collection would require federal authorization." He let that sit for a moment. "Which would not be granted." Clara held his gaze. "How long does that designation take?" "Under normal circumstances, 6 to 8 months." Ferris looked at the barn again, at the journals, at the instruments. "Under emergency preservation circumstances, where a significant collection is under active threat, the process can be expedited to 30 days. Clara breathed. "Would you consider this an emergency preservation circumstance?" "I would," Ferris said. "I absolutely would." She almost let the relief show. She kept it contained, but just barely, and she thought Ferris was perceptive enough to see it anyway, because he nodded once with the expression of a man who understood exactly what that answer meant in the context of everything she had not told him directly. "I'll need 3 days to document the collection," he said. "And your full cooperation." "You have it," Clara said. She left him to his work and went to find Callum. He was at the fence line on the east side of the property, checking the postwork he'd done earlier in the week. She came across the field toward him, and he saw her coming, and stopped what he was doing, and waited, reading her face from 20 feet away. 30 days, she said when she reached him. "Emergency designation. Federal protection." Callum let out a breath, slow and deliberate the way a man releases something he has been holding for a while. 30 days, he said. "Crane can't touch it after that, not without federal authorization, which he will never get." She looked at the fence line, at the 40 acres around her, at the sky above Colorado territory wide and high, and entirely indifferent to the ambitions of men who believed they could own things that weren't theirs. "It's over." "Not quite yet," Callum said. "Crane doesn't know that." "He will soon enough." Callum looked at her. Something in his face was doing what it sometimes did, moving toward something, then steadying, then moving again. She had been watching that particular internal negotiation for 9 days, and she had her own position on how it was going to resolve, but she was a patient woman. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "When this is settled," he said, "when the designation comes through and the hearing is resolved and Greer's done what he needs to do." He stopped, took a different approach. "I've been ranching this territory alone for 5 years. I bought land east of yours when I came out from Kansas. Good land, good water. I built it up right." He was looking at the fence line, not at her, with the concentrated attention of a man who finds honesty easier when he's looking at something solid and fixed. It's a good piece of ground, but it's been a quiet one. He paused. I reckon I've been waiting for it to feel like something more than just a place I work. Clara looked at him for a moment. Callum Hayes, she said. Are you telling me your ranch is lonely? He looked at her then. Direct. I'm telling you, I'd like it to not be. The morning light was across the field between them, and his face was entirely open. No door closed anywhere in it. And Clara thought about 6 years of keeping a wagon hitched on long rides just in case. About sitting across from her in the desert without asking unnecessary questions. About centering the tables so people felt like they belonged in the room. Ask me again, she said. When the designation comes through. Something shifted in his face. Not disappointment. Recognition. He understood she wasn't saying no. She was saying she wanted to choose her own ground. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, and he turned back to the fence, and she turned back toward the barn, and the morning continued around them both. The next 3 days with Edmund Ferris were dense and productive. He documented every item in the collection with the thoroughness of a man who understood that what he was holding required the most careful possible record. Clara worked alongside him, cross-referencing his documentation against Whitmore's journals, catching details. He missed suggesting contextual notes that transformed the inventory from a list of objects into a living record of what Nathaniel Whitmore had actually been building and why. On the second evening, Ferris looked up from the documentation he was preparing and said, "You understand this material as well as any archivist I've worked with." "I've had 9 days with it," Clara said, "and I was motivated." "No." He shook his head. "This is more than familiarity. You understand how it connects. The instruments to the journals, to the maps, to the philosophical framework. You see it as a whole." He looked at her carefully. "Have you considered formal education? The Territorial University in Boulder has a natural sciences program." Clara looked at him. "I'm a farmer with 40 acres and an ongoing legal dispute." "That's what you are at the moment," Ferris said. "It need not be the totality of what you become." She held that, filed it. In the place where she kept things that were true, but that she wasn't ready to act on yet. The morning Ferris prepared to leave, he handed her a formal receipt for his documentation and a preliminary letter on Historical Society letterhead, stating that the Whitmore collection had been assessed by an authorized representative and was being recommended for emergency federal designation. "Frame this," he said. "Put it somewhere visible. Anyone who comes onto this property with intentions that conflict with federal preservation law will see it and know what they're dealing with." "I will," she said. He shook her hand again. "Miss Bennett, whatever happens with the legal matter, and I believe the evidence is strongly in your favor, this collection is now known. The society knows it exists. I know it exists. That cannot be unknown." He met her eyes. "Nathaniel Whitmore spent his life believing that knowledge once shared protects itself. You've proven him right." He rode toward town. Clara watched him go. Then she turned back to the farm and went to work. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. In the days between Ferris's departure and the hearing, things in Harlow Creek moved with the particular speed of a situation that had reached critical mass. Gerald delivered his formal statement to Greer. Harlan Mew's affidavit was filed. Commissioner Albright's written statement was filed. Thomas Reed signed on as a community witness to the establishment and operation of the Whitmore Workshop, which was the name Clara had given the barn, and which had appeared on 3 handmade signs in town that she had neither commissioned nor asked for. The signs had appeared overnight. She had not asked who put them there. She suspected Martha Holt had organized it, which was the kind of efficient, quiet action Martha Holt was known for. Crane made one more move. It came 2 days before the hearing in the form of a counterfiling from his own lawyer, a different one. Not Mew, someone from the county seat, 40 miles east, challenging the injunction on procedural grounds and contesting the validity of the pre-executed deed on the basis that it represented a private contractual arrangement, not evidence of fraud. Greer read the counterfiling, set it down, and said, "He's running." "Running," Clara said. "This argument doesn't hold. He knows it doesn't hold. A man with Crane's resources and his lawyer's ability could construct a significantly more sophisticated challenge. Greer tapped the counterfiling. This is a man buying time, creating procedural delay while he decides what to concede. Clara thought about that. He's going to try to settle. Before the hearing, Greer said. My estimate, he'll make an approach in the next 48 hours. The approach came in 36. It came through a third party. Clara had not expected Reverend Marsh, who arrived at the farm on a Wednesday afternoon, looking like a man who deeply wished he were somewhere else. Clara met him in the yard. Miss Bennet, the Reverend said, I've been asked to convey an offer. She looked at him steadily. By whom? I had the grace to look uncomfortable. A message was relayed to me through the county commissioner's office. I want to be clear that I have no personal stake in this matter and that I am acting only as a messenger. Convey the offer, Clara said. Marsh straightened his coat. The offer is this: all legal challenges to the property transfer are withdrawn. Full title to the Bennett farm is confirmed in your name. The existing transfer documents are voided. In return, the counterclaimant requests that no further legal action be pursued regarding the pre-executed deed and that the matter be considered closed. Clara was quiet for a moment. Around her the farm was midday. Quiet, the sound of Callum's hammer from inside the barn, a steady background rhythm she had come to find as reliable as a heartbeat. That's the offer, she said. That's the offer, Marsh confirmed. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No. No reference to my father. Marsh looked at his hands. No, Clara breathed. She had known this moment would come, and she had spent considerable time preparing what she believed about it. The land was what she had fought for. The land and the workshop and the right to be on the ground her father had built. She could have that now cleanly without a hearing, without the risk that a county court in Crane's territory would find a way to rule against even the strongest evidence. She could be safe. Right now. Today. She looked at the barn. At the Whitmore workshop sign that someone had nailed to the doorframe, her handwriting. She noticed which meant Tommy Briggs had probably done it, because Tommy Briggs had been appearing at the farm regularly enough that she'd started giving him things to do. She thought about Nathaniel Whitmore's letter. The world is full of people who were told they were not enough. Most of them believed it. She thought about her father on a list. Her father's name in Harlan Mew's cabinet, in a filing prepared while he was still alive, still working, still bringing eggs to the market every Tuesday, and feeding his horses before he asked about anything else. No, she said. Marsh blinked. Miss Bennet. No, she said again. I want the hearing. I want the pre-executed deed entered into the public court record. I want Commissioner Albright's statement read aloud in a court of law. I want Harlan Mew's affidavit on the public record. She looked at the Reverend. My father's name was on a list. Someone decided while he was alive and working and causing no harm to anyone that his land would be taken from him upon his death. That is not a private matter to be settled quietly. That is a matter of public record. Marsh looked at her. Something moved through his face, that same quality she had seen in Whitfield and in Albright and in Gerald. That quality of a person completing a revision of who they had previously thought she was. I'll convey your answer, he said. Please do. She paused. And Reverend Marsh. He stopped. You spoke at my father's funeral. You said he was a good and steady man who served his community without seeking recognition. She met his eyes. That was true. Make sure you remember it clearly when people ask you later what kind of man Joseph Bennet was. Because they will ask. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once with something that approached real solemnity and walked back to his horse. Clara went back inside and told Callum. He set down the tool he was holding. You turned down a clean settlement. I turned down a quiet one, she said. It wasn't clean. Clean would have included an acknowledgement of what was done to my father. Callum looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said, not objecting, not cautioning, simply accepting the decision as hers to make, which was a quality in him that continued to surprise her with its consistency. Are you worried, she said, about the hearing? He picked up his tool again. No, Greer has everything he needs. Crane's counterfiling was weak. The commissioner's statement alone is enough to destroy the transfer. He paused. I'm not worried about the hearing. Then what are you worried about? He looked at her sideways. Who says I'm worried? You've been working that same board for 20 minutes, she said. He looked down at this board, set down the tool. I'm not worried, he said. He stopped. I don't like the part where things are almost done. It's the part that goes wrong most often. She understood that. She felt it herself. The particular vulnerability of being almost at the finish of something that has cost everything, where the possibility of loss is sharpest, precisely because the possibility of winning has become real. Almost done, she said, is still almost. Yes, ma'am? He picked up the tool. 2 more days. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a single room that doubled as the territorial court when the circuit judge was in residence. Judge Harriet Calloway and Clara had not known when Greer told her the judge's name whether to consider it significant that the judge was a woman, and had decided that she would simply consider it a fact. Arrived from the county seat the evening before, and was known by reputation as a woman who moved fast and had very little patience for anything that wasted her time. Clara sat beside Greer at the plaintiff's table. Callum sat in the public gallery behind her third row directly behind her right shoulder, and she was acutely aware of his presence there, the way she had become acutely aware of his presence in any room. Steady, reliable, pointed in her direction without making a production of it. Thomas Reed sat beside Callum. Martha Holt beside Reed. Amos Whitfield, who had come without being asked, sat in the back row with his hands folded in his lap, and the expression of a man who was prepared to tell the truth and was not comfortable about it and was going to do it anyway. Gerald was there, in the third row on the opposite side from Callum. He caught Clara's eye when she came in and nodded once. She nodded back. Crane was not present. His new lawyer sat at the defendant's table alone, which told Clara something about what Crane thought was going to happen in this room. Judge Calloway was 60, silver-haired, and had the bearing of a woman who had spent 30 years being the only one in her field, and had decided early on that this was simply a condition of her work rather than a reason to slow down. She read through the filed documents for 12 minutes in complete silence, which was 11 minutes longer than Clara had expected, and felt much longer than that. Then the judge looked up. "Mr. Greer," she said. "A pre-executed deed dated 6 months prior to the property owner's death. A co-ownership filing showing the claimant's name on the original land grant. A county commissioner's sworn statement that his seal was affixed without authorization. A supporting affidavit from the attorney who prepared the fraudulent document." She set the papers down. "Is there anything in the defendant's counterfiling that you'd like me to take seriously?" Crane's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, the counterfiling argues that the pre-executed deed represents a private contractual." "I read the counterfiling," Judge Calloway said. "I asked if there was anything in it I should take seriously." She looked at the lawyer. "There isn't. Sit down." The lawyer sat down. The judge looked at Clara. "Direct assessment, quick and thorough. Miss Bennett, your father filed the original land grant jointly with your name in 1867. Yes, Your Honor. You were 8 years old. Yes. Your father registered you as a co-owner of the property at the age of 8. He did." Judge Calloway was quiet for a moment. That is not a man who expected his daughter to end up without a claim on what he built. She looked at the documents again. It is also not a man who expected his property to be targeted by a fraudulent deed arrangement executed while he was still alive. The room was very quiet. "The transfer documents filed following Joseph Bennett's death are hereby invalidated," Judge Calloway said. "The pre-executed deed is entered into the public record as evidence of fraudulent intent and will be referred to the Territorial Attorney General for further investigation. Full title to the Bennett property is confirmed in the name of Clara Bennett as co-registrant of the original 1867 homestead grant." She looked at Crane's lawyer. "I trust that's clear." "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer said. He said it the way a man speaks when he knows the conversation is over and he is primarily focused on how quickly he can leave the room. Judge Calloway signed the order, handed it to the clerk, looked at Clara one more time. "Miss Bennett," she said, I understand there is a federal preservation filing pending for the Whitmore collection on your property. Yes, Your Honor. Good. She stood. This court is adjourned. The room exhaled. Not all at once, it was too contained for that too full of people who had been holding themselves carefully, but in pieces. Clara heard Martha Holt release a breath behind her, heard Thomas Reed's quiet murmur of something satisfied, heard faintly the sound of Callum shifting in the row behind her. She sat still for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and the judge's signed order was now in Greer's hands, and her father's land was hers, was confirmed hers by the authority of the territorial court in writing public record irreversible. Greer put the order on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It's done, Greer said quietly. She looked at her father's name on the original grant, at her own name beside it written in a land office clerk's careful hand in 1867, when she was 8 years old, and her father had walked into that office and told them to write her name down too, because this land was hers as much as his, and he had wanted the world to know it. She picked up the order, folded it, put it inside her coat beside Whitmore's letter where it belonged. She turned. Callum was standing. His hat was in his hands. His face was doing the open thing again, the thing he allowed in specific circumstances, and she walked directly to him without stopping. The way a person walks toward something they have decided on. It's done, she said. I heard. His voice was quiet, low, for her alone. You all right? Better than all right. She looked at him. You asked me something at the fence line. Something in his face went very still. I said to ask again when it was done. It's done, she said. Callum Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then he put his hat back on, reached out and offered her his hand. Not a formal gesture, not a performance, just his hand open offered. She took it. Martha Holt made a sound behind them that was officially a cough and unofficially nothing of the sort. Thomas Reed said something quiet to Callum that made Callum's jaw move with suppressed amusement. Gerald Bennett, passing on his way to the door, paused for just a moment and looked at Clara with an expression that had shed everything that wasn't genuine, and said without words that he was glad this had gone the way it had. She met his eyes, nodded once, he nodded back, and left. The federal designation came through in 22 days, 8 days ahead of the projected 30. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as Edmund Ferris, which Clara chose to consider a good omen, because she was entitled to consider whatever she liked. The Whitmore Workshop became officially and federally the Nathaniel Whitmore Educational Collection and Workshop, a protected historical site in the territory of Colorado. The designation meant that no county-level action, no property claim, no eminent domain proceeding, no court order below the federal level could touch it. It was in the most literal legal sense untouchable. Eli Crane left Harlow Creek 3 weeks after the hearing. He did not announce his departure. He simply was there 1 week and gone the next, his lumber operation transferred to a manager who had no interest in county politics. The Territorial Attorney General's office sent 2 men to review the pre-executed deed filing and several other county records that had come to their attention in connection with it. Amos Whitfield cooperated fully. Commissioner Albright cooperated fully. Harlan Mew cooperated fully. The investigation took 4 months. At the end of it, there were 3 formal findings of fraud and 1 referral to the Federal Circuit Court. Clara was not required to testify. Greer handled everything she needed handled. She was aware of the proceedings. The way you are aware of something happening in an adjacent room present significant, but not the room you are standing in. She was standing in the workshop. In the 6 months following the designation, the Whitmore Workshop drew visitors from 4 counties. A schoolteacher from Pueblo brought her entire class on a Saturday. 2 men from the Territorial University came to see the instrument collection and stayed for 3 days. A woman from Kansas City, who had read about the discovery in a Denver newspaper, arrived alone one October morning and stood in front of the mounted maps for 40 minutes without speaking, and then turned to Clara with wet eyes and said, "I wanted to be a scientist when I was a girl. I didn't know that was something a person like me was allowed to want." Clara had taken her hands. "It is," she said. "Come back whenever you like." The woman came back 4 more times that year. By the spring, she was corresponding with Ferris at the Historical Society and had begun a documentation project of her own. Thomas Reed's son learned celestial navigation from Whitmore's journals and wrote a letter to the Territorial Observatory that was answered to everyone's considerable surprise by the observatory's chief astronomer, who invited the boy to visit. Tommy Briggs learned to read the maps properly and appointed himself unofficial workshop guide, which he did with the particular authority of a 12-year-old who has decided he is the expert on a subject and does not intend to be argued with. Martha Holt organized a monthly reading group around Whitmore's philosophical journals that met in the workshop on the last Sunday of every month and had within 3 months outgrown the space available. On the wall behind the main work table, Clara kept 2 things. The first was her grandfather's map framed in glass. The faded lines and Eli's careful surveyor's notations preserved exactly as he had drawn them. Beside it, a small card in Clara's handwriting. This map was given to me by Eli Bennett, surveyor, 1875. He told me to find what it led to when I needed it. He was right. The second was Nathaniel Whitmore's letter, also framed exactly as he had written it. Beside it, another card. This letter was found in the desert of Colorado Territory, October 1884, after 80 years of waiting. It was addressed to whoever was brave enough to find it. I found it. I intend to be worthy of it. Callum had made both frames, worked them in his own time from good wood with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything he built. He had said nothing when he installed them. She had not asked him to make them. He had simply seen what was needed and done it, which was characteristic. The ranch east of the Bennett property was no longer quiet. She had said yes to him in early winter, standing at the fence line, where he had first talked around the question, and he had looked at her the way a man looks when something he has been carrying for a while has finally been set down in the right place. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no audience. The fence between their properties was still technically a fence, though the gate between them was by that point open more often than it was closed. They were married in the spring. Reverend Marsh officiated, which Clara permitted because the man had looked her father's memory in the eye and not flinched, and that counted for something. Martha Holt organized everything practical about the event. Thomas Reed made them a gift of iron, a lantern hand-forged, that hung at the entrance of the workshop and was lit every morning the building was open. At the reception held in the workshop itself, because there was no other space in Harlow Creek large enough and right enough for it. Clara stood beside Callum with her hand in his and looked at the room full of people who had come. She looked at the frames on the wall, at her grandfather's map and Whitmore's letter. She thought about 2 old men who had spent their lives laying groundwork for people they would never meet, who had trusted without evidence and without guarantee that the right person would come along and do something real with what they had left behind. She thought about her father writing her 8-year-old name on a land grant because he had decided that the world should know officially and permanently that she was someone who owned things, who belonged to a place, who mattered. She had spent 25 years being told she was nothing. She had spent the last 6 months watching the people around her discover what her father and her grandfather had always known. That the woman no one believed in had been the entire time exactly the person the moment required. The lantern Thomas Reed made burned at the workshop entrance every morning for the next 30 years through Colorado winters and summer droughts, and the particular slow changes that turn territories into states and frontier towns into something that begins cautiously to look like a future. People came from farther and farther away to learn, to read, to use instruments built by a dead man's hands and study maps drawn by a woman who had once walked into a desert with nothing but a worn leather satchel and her grandfather's faith in her, and had come back with everything. Clara Bennett, Clara Hayes. After the spring became known across the territory, not as the woman who had found the wagon, though that was true, and not as the woman who had defeated Eli Crane, though that was also true. She became known as the person who had built something that belonged to everyone, and every person who walked through that workshop door, every blacksmith's son who learned to read the stars, every woman who discovered for the first time that knowledge was something she was allowed to want, every child who pressed their hands against Nathaniel Whitmore's instruments and felt the thrill of a world larger than anyone had told them they were entitled to. Every one of them was proof of the same stubborn, undefeatable truth. The people no one believes in are not nothing. They are simply waiting for the moment when the ground opens and shows them what has always been buried there, patient and real, waiting only for someone brave enough to dig. Clara Bennett dug. And what she found did not just change her life. It changed the lives of every person who came after her, which was exactly what a 25-year-old woman from a 40-acre farm, who had once been told she would never make it, had always